There is a fighter on the UFC Freedom 250 White House card who has won 7 fights in a row, who has beaten Jose Aldo and Chito Vera and a list of legitimate top-level bantamweights, who trained with John Danaher for 17 consecutive weeks, driving 8 hours every single Sunday to sleep on a teammate's couch just to get the extra work in, and most of the MMA world still has no idea who he is. His name is Iman Zahabi. He is fighting former bantamweight champion Sean O'Malley in what the UFC is billing as a feature fight on the biggest card in the history of the organization. And based on everything he said in a recent interview, he genuinely believes he has O'Malley's number. Not in the way that fighters say that before a fight to generate hype. In the specific, detailed, technically grounded way that a man says it when he has spent months studying every frame of his opponent's film and found something real. Before we get into what Zahabi actually said and why it matters, let's establish the full context of who this man is, because the background here is as interesting as the fight itself. Iman Zahabi is the younger brother of Firas Zahabi, the head coach at TriStar Gym in Montreal, the man widely considered one of the greatest MMA coaches of all time, the man who guided Georges St-Pierre through the most dominant championship reign in UFC welterweight history. Iman grew up inside that environment. He trained alongside GSP. He has had access, from the beginning of his combat sports education, to coaching and methodology and fight intelligence that most fighters spend their entire careers trying to find. And yet, despite that background, despite that name, despite 7 consecutive wins against legitimate opponents, he has been operating almost entirely in the background while the sports attention went elsewhere. The White House card is the moment that changes that. And based on how he talked about this opportunity, he knows exactly what it means and he is not going to let it pass quietly. The fight against Sean O'Malley is fascinating on multiple levels, and the stylistic analysis here is genuinely worth spending time on. O'Malley's game is built around a few very specific weapons. The step-back right hand is the central piece. He creates space, he baits opponents into advancing, and he times that counter right hand with exceptional precision. His teep kicks are used to manage distance and keep opponents from establishing their own rhythm. He has a dangerous spinning back kick that he deploys at unexpected moments. And he has consistently found success targeting the body against opponents who prioritize head defense. These are real weapons. They are responsible for his rise through the division and his championship run. And Zahabi has watched every piece of film, identified every tendency, and built a camp around exploiting specifically the things that O'Malley himself has essentially acknowledged as vulnerabilities. Here is what makes the Zahabi versus O'Malley matchup particularly interesting from a technical standpoint. O'Malley's 2 most notable competitive struggles have come against Marlon Vera and against Merab Dvalishvili, and both of those losses or competitive performances share a structural similarity. When opponents take away his preferred distance, when they crowd him, when they use wrestling to remove his ability to create space and set up his counters, O'Malley's offense becomes significantly less effective. He is not a fighter who excels when the fight is made uncomfortable through physical pressure and level changes. His defensive grappling has been a documented weak point across multiple training camp reports and fight analyses. And Zahabi, who spent 17 weeks working with John Danaher's Death Squad on the cutting edge of wrestling and jiu-jitsu, has tools in that department that he has barely shown in his recent fights because he has been winning comfortably on the feet. Zahabi was direct about this in his interview, without giving away specific tactical details. He acknowledged that O'Malley knows his own weaknesses, the legs, the wrestling, the step-back right hand that everyone in the division has studied extensively. And Zahabi made the point that in high-level fighting, knowing what your opponent wants to do and stopping them from doing it are 2 completely different problems. He used the Merab and O'Malley rematch as a reference. Both fighters knew exactly what was coming the second time around, both camps had made adjustments, and yet the fight still unfolded in ways that surprised people because execution under real pressure is where game plans either hold or collapse. Knowledge of a tendency is not the same as neutralizing it. And Zahabi's confidence going into this fight is not the confidence of a man who thinks O'Malley is overrated. It is the confidence of a man who believes his specific preparation has created a specific solution to a specific problem. What stands out about Zahabi as a fighter, and this is something the hardcore bantamweight fanbase has been talking about for a while, even if the casual audience hasn't caught up, is his stylistic unconventionality. His striking is technically sound. He is not making fundamental errors. He is not leaving obvious openings through bad mechanics. But the presentation of his technique is unusual in ways that create genuine problems for opponents who have been trained to recognize and respond to traditional patterns. His timing breaks in unexpected places. His angles are unorthodox. His rhythm doesn't sync up with what strikers at this level are conditioned to anticipate. He beat Jose Aldo, one of the most technically refined strikers in the history of the sport, a man who spent years as the untouchable featherweight champion, on the feet, in a fight where Aldo tried to take him down and couldn't impose his grappling game, and where Zahabi's unconventional striking created timing problems that Aldo clearly did not have a clean answer for. That is not a small thing. That is a meaningful data point about what Zahabi brings to a high-level striking exchange. The personal story behind this fight is also worth understanding fully, because it adds a dimension to Zahabi's motivation that goes beyond the standard pre-fight narrative of wanting a title shot. He went 1-2 early in his UFC career. 2 losses in the organization put him in the position where a third loss almost certainly means a release. That is a specific kind of pressure that changes fighters. Either it breaks them or it forces a level of self-examination that produces genuine growth. Zahabi described going into a deep period of reflection, reading psychology and self-help books, asking himself who he actually was as a fighter and where the losses were coming from. He identified that success had made him careless, that the confidence of an undefeated run had produced a version of himself that wasn't as sharp as the version that had climbed to that point. He went back to fundamentals, drove 8 hours every Sunday for 4 months to work with John Danaher, rebuilt pieces of his game that needed rebuilding, and then went on the 7-fight win streak that put him in this position. That is not a story of talent. That is a story of character. And character is what determines how fighters perform in the moments that matter most. The GSP dimension of this story deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is directly relevant to what happens in the cage on fight night. The night before Zahabi left for Washington, D.C., he had a 1-hour phone call with Georges St-Pierre. Not a conversation about technique. A conversation about visualization, about managing the psychological pressure of the biggest moment of his career, about keeping the blinders on in an environment filled with distractions and theatrics and the weight of performing on the most visible stage the sport has ever created. GSP has been in that position, in the biggest fights of his generation, against the best opponents of his era, in arenas and moments that carried the kind of pressure that breaks fighters who aren't prepared for it. The advice he gave Zahabi is the distilled wisdom of someone who navigated all of that successfully, repeatedly, over a championship reign that lasted years. That is not a generic pre-fight pep talk. That is specific, earned, battle-tested knowledge being transferred directly to a fighter the night before the most important fight of his life. Sean O'Malley comes into this fight as a significant favorite, and it is worth taking that seriously rather than dismissing it. He is a former champion. He has elite striking ability. His chin has generally held up well under fire. His footwork and distance management create real problems for fighters who rely on traditional forward pressure without the wrestling to back it up. The case for O'Malley winning this fight is straightforward. He lands the step-back right hand, he uses his movement to keep Zahabi on the outside where his counters are less effective, and his striking accuracy compounds over rounds in a way that judges recognize and score. That is a legitimate path to victory, and it is the most commonly assumed outcome. What makes this fight interesting is that Zahabi's game plan appears specifically designed to prevent that path from opening. If Zahabi can control the distance in a way that denies O'Malley the ability to create his preferred space, if the leg kicks that O'Malley's camp has essentially pre-acknowledged as a vulnerability land consistently and early, and if Zahabi's wrestling and grappling credentials, which he has described as cards he hasn't needed to show yet in recent fights, force O'Malley to manage a threat he has historically not managed well, this fight becomes much more competitive than the odds suggest. Zahabi himself projected a TKO, predicting he finds the finish somewhere in round 2 or 3. He acknowledged O'Malley's resilience. The comeback against Sonia Dong was genuine, but he also pointed out that O'Malley has publicly stated that a loss in this fight would likely mean retirement. That is an enormous amount of psychological pressure to carry into a high-stakes fight. Fighters who are fighting to preserve a legacy, who have already framed losing as the end of something, do not always produce their best performances. The urgency can work against them in ways that are hard to predict from the outside but very real in the cage. There is also a commercial narrative operating in the background of this fight that is worth acknowledging. The UFC put Zahabi on the White House card for specific reasons. Hunter Campbell told his camp directly that this fight could function as a title eliminator, that a convincing performance against a former champion, on the biggest stage in the organization's history, in front of an audience that includes millions of casual viewers who have never watched a UFC event before, could accelerate the title conversation in ways that a win on a standard fight night card never would. But Campbell also gave them the honest version of the message: you can't just win. You have to win in a way that tells a story that sells. The organization needs footage, needs a moment, needs the kind of performance that becomes the video they put in the pre-fight package for a title fight. Zahabi understands this. He said it directly. He cannot go out there and give them a snooze fest and expect a title shot. He has to leave a mark. And the bantamweight division, with Peter Yan and Merab Dvalishvili operating at the top of the rankings, has room for a fighter who makes a sufficiently loud statement to insert himself into that conversation. What this fight ultimately comes down to is execution. Both fighters know each other's tendencies. Both camps have spent months studying the same film. Both fighters are walking into Sunday with detailed, specific game plans built around exploiting what they believe to be the other man's vulnerabilities. O'Malley's camp knows Zahabi wants to crowd him, pressure him, take away the space that makes his striking work. Zahabi's camp knows O'Malley wants to keep him on the outside, bait the advance, and time the step-back right hand. The question is which man executes their plan more completely under the specific pressure of a White House crowd, a globally distributed broadcast, and the knowledge that this fight has real career-defining stakes for both of them. The pick here is Zahabi, and it is not a blind upset call. It is based on the stylistic matchup, the quality of his preparation as he described it, the wrestling credential he has not needed to show but carries as a genuine weapon, and the specific vulnerability in O'Malley's game that his camp has built around. The finish projection, round 2 or 3, TKO, is aggressive but consistent with how this fight figures to unfold if Zahabi's game plan works the way he believes it will. If O'Malley finds the right hand early and changes the dynamic, all of that analysis gets recalibrated in real time. But if Zahabi can deny O'Malley his preferred distance and make this fight uncomfortable from the opening bell, the bantamweight division is about to get a conversation it wasn't expecting before Sunday night. 7 fights. 8 hours of driving every Sunday. 20 years of work. The White House. Iman Zahabi's moment is here.